This is a lecture for the second part of James Still's River of Earth. In this section, we have the narrator going to live with the grandmother. And as the section begins, and in my text, this is on page 101, they're divided into distinct sections, so whatever text you have, you should be able to find this easily enough. We have, as has been pretty typical throughout the novel structurally, sections and chapters beginning with the phases of the seasons. So here we have the fall, and what's happening in the fall, which is consistent and accurate with the kind of lifestyle that would have certainly predated the coal industry and the changes to lifestyle that the dependence upon the coal economy imposed upon the people in Eastern Kentucky, is their preparations for winter. So, a big part of the preparation here is the garden, taking care of the garden. Remember that as one of the metaphors for the novel as a whole, is the garden against the machine, and the garden as a lifestyle that's sustaining to life as opposed to the machine or the mind, the industry that is sustaining to life, and how those come into conflict. So the narrator then has gone to spend time with the grandmother to help out with the grandmother because she's living by herself, of course, and she's older and somewhat separated from the children. That is an additional conflict within this novel, and I'll point out some key passages as we get to those moments where that conflict is related to us, is illustrated to us. So this begins with the preparation for winter, and preparation for winter begins with gathering from the garden, harvesting, and storing away. This is something, if you're from Eastern Kentucky or West Virginia, any place in the Appalachian Mountains, this has not gone away as part of the culture. This is still, very much part of what a lot of people still feel a need to do, which is to garden. That's part of what is still with us. So fall had been dry, and the giant milkweed pods broke early in September. Lean Neck Creek dried to a thread, and all the springs under the moss were damp pockets without a sound of water. Father had sent me over from Little Car to stay with Grandma while Uncle Jolly laid out a spell in the county jail. Okay, so again, part of the narrative that involves Uncle Jolly is that continuously he is ending up in jail, and it's not that he is a necessarily criminal type of figure. He is not a mean-spirited, malicious character like Brack Baldridge's cousins Harl and Tib. He's just very high-spirited. He gets into fights. He gets into mischief. Most of the activities that bring him up against the legal system, and involve really kind of doing what he thinks is right. So he's been again in jail, and the reason for him being in jail, well, I'll get to this passage where this is discussed in just a moment. But just this discussion of how the harvesting season is occurring and getting ready for the wintertime, and the grandmother being developed as a character. So here's a characteristic passage of her talking. This is on page 102, and she's complaining. Yeah, she's complaining about the children, her sons, not coming to see her often enough. And on one hand, and I was thinking this as I was rereading this text again, and I've read this text many times. This is can be taken as tragic, and certainly it is tragic. But I also, the more I read this, the more times I read this, I begin to see a little bit of humor. More and more, I see a kind of a humorous take that still seems to have on this character of the grandma. There's this kind of an implication with her of sort of imposing guilt, feeling sorry for herself. And it's not that she doesn't have reason to feel sorry for herself, but she gets on actually, a little bit better maybe than she makes out. But she is just feeling lonely, and she wants these children to come and see her. So she'll say things like this. It's Rilla that's keeping him away, Grandma said. Luce's woman was always sought again him doing for his old mommy. I reckon Luce fotched her off too young. She wasn't nigh 16 when they married. This laying of blame on the wife of one of her sons, and it just sort of overstating the issue just a bit. You're laying a blame and feeling like she is being victimized somewhat. That's just an aspect of character, a realistic aspect of character that still is managing. But contrast these characters, like Grandma, with some of the characters again that we had in Trail of the Lonesome Pine, and you see how distinct they are. Grandma, her characteristics, her traits, very human, very realistic. We see her, I say we, based on my reading of this and as a reader, much more as a character, much more as a human being, less of a caricature, which I think is one of the flaws that we had very much with Trail of the Lonesome Pine, is that so many of the characters, certainly those in the background, are more caricature than character. We waited for Uncle Luce until the moon was full in October. The leaves ripened, and the air was bloated with the smell of pawpaws, where the black fruit lay rotting upon the ground. Possums came to feed there in the night, and 2 got into a box trap I set above the barn. We ate one steeped in gravy with sweet potatoes. Okay, now this again illustrates the self-reliance, the absolute necessity for self-reliance that people in this time would have had, and afterwards, for decades afterwards, not just immediately there, but it was absolutely essential that they be able to live off the land, to provide themselves with the gardens, but also to take advantage of any kind of game that they could get. Most people in this contemporary times, myself included, I didn't grow up eating possums. I didn't have that level of privation in my life, and I'm from Eastern Kentucky. I did not have that level of privation in my life that these characters had, that my parents had, and my grandparents had. And so there's such great change culturally that has occurred because of so many of the conditions that have been imposed upon the region. One morning, Grandma said we could wait no longer for Uncle Luce. She took a grapevine walking stick and we went into the cornfield. We worked 2 days pulling corn from the small hole-tinted stalks. When all the runty ears were gathered, she measured them into pokes, and again that word pokes, meaning a bag, a sack, something to carry things in, pulling her bonnet down over her face to hide the rheumatic pain. Again, there's this historical accuracy here. Going into the sun, women would cover up bonnets over their heads, over their faces, long sleeves to keep from being browned by the sun. It was just they didn't want to be browned by the sun. It's just historical accuracy. 103, the garden, the harvesting detailed here. With the corn in, we waited a few days until Grandma's rheumatism had been doctored with herbs and bitter cherry bark tea. Then there were the heavy-leaved cabbages, the cushaws, and sweet potatoes to be gathered. The potatoes had grown large that year. They were fat and big as squashes. Grandma crawled along the rows on her knees, digging in the baked earth with her hands. It was good to see such fine potatoes. When Jolly came home, he'll sure eat a bellyful, she said. So they're gathering, they're getting ready for the wintertime and the difficulty. And if you recall back into the very first section of this, the very first chapter, you see the difficulty of the family, of the Baldridge family, just getting through the wintertime without starvation. The days shortened, the air grew frosty, nights were loud with honking geese, and suddenly the leaves were down before gusts of wind. The days were noisy with blowing, the house filled with the sound of cricket thighs. I'm going to indulge myself in providing this lecture to you, indulge myself by frequently reading lyrical passages. Still was a poet, remember, as much as he was a fiction writer. And he considered himself, I think I can say with confidence, I knew him, I used to talk to him frequently. He thought of himself more as a poet. He thought of himself as a poet first, before he thought of himself, I think, as a story writer. And even then, he used to refer to himself, he used to refer to his poetry as verse, as if he was making a distinction between what he saw himself writing as poetry and maybe what he regarded to be as great literary poetry. I never questioned him about that, but that's my sense that this is a little bit of an aside. I'm taking a different track here, but I think that he had such a great respect for real literary writing that he possibly felt that he had not reached it, or he did, and that's not uncommon with writers. It's not uncommon for writers to have a somewhat of a distorted or not absolutely objective viewpoint of their own writing. But he certainly, to my reading, the more I read still, and particularly this text, there's no doubt in my mind that he stands among the great literary writers in American literature, in American writing, not just as a regional writer. So Uncle Luce comes. Uncle Luce came after the first frost. He came whistling up the path from Dry Neck with the icy stones crackling under his feet. Since the gathering, the harvesting, Grandma had been in bed with rheumatism in her back, getting up only to cook. Uncle Luce was full of excuses. Rilla was sick. It was getting near her time. He's pregnant. His 4 daughters had had chicken pox. I'm hoping and praying the next one will be a boy child, Luce said. A day's coming when I'll need help with my crap. And crap meaning crop. Crop. He is still using with the dialogue and the dialect, creating the sound, creating the dialect of the people. In a, again, to my reading, a much more effective and accurate rendition of dialect than John Fox Jr. managed. Girls ain't fittin' to grub stumps and hold a plow in the ground. And I think I've mentioned this word "hain't" before. And I think John Fox Jr. somewhat used that, but not so much accurately. If you look at any the literature, the scholarship about Appalachian English of this particular period, then you'll see that their speech patterns hain't, where the consonant would sometimes be used on the word ain't, and where at other times it would not be. Depends on where it falls in the sentence. That's another discussion. It's something maybe would be fun to talk about. So the grandma is worried about her pony, or horse. It's called, used for plowing, for many things, and this pony is called Poppet, old Poppet. She's worried about it being, it's getting on in years. She's worried about it surviving the winter. She's hoping that Luce will take the old Poppet to care for through the winter. I ain't got feed for my own beast, Luce said. I'll be buying corn for my horse mule for another month. Poppet had already ate more than she's worth. She must be 12 years old. The days are coming you'll need another nag to crap with. And again, crap, meaning crop. Crop can be used either as a noun or a verb. It would be right proper to take old Poppet out and end her misery. Grandma raised up in anger. Luce Middleton, if you was in search, I'd pop your mouth, she said. Then she lay back and cried a little. Uncle Luce went over and shook her, saying he never meant a word about Poppet. He wouldn't shoot her for a war pension. That's an old expression, a war pension. To be a pension to be collected after military service. Obviously, you get that in context, but that is an expression that once was heard often. I can recall hearing this expression from when I was a child. Maybe that really shows my age. I don't know. I have more memory for long ago than I do for yesterday. Immediately yesterday. So there's discussion about Uncle Jolly. Uncle Jolly's trial has come up. What his crime actually has been. He's been sentenced for 2 years in the state penitentiary. Let's find this specific passage for you. She speaks about Jolly. Grandma's voice trembled as she spoke. He ain't mean to the bone, and he's the only one of my boys that looks after me. I fear I won't live till he gets back. I pray the Lord to keep me breathing till he comes. That's an old person. That's an old person. That's an old person in any culture, anywhere in the world. That concern, that expression of that concern. 107. Okay, here I'm going to indulge myself with a reading of this wonderful lyric language. During the short winter days, the sun was feeble and pale, shining without heat. Frost lay thick in the mornings, and crusts of hard earth rose in the night on little toadstools of ice. Footsteps upon the ground rang metal clear, and there was a pattern of furred feet where rabbits came down out of the barren fields into the yard. Now, I just want to pause and regard that. You hear what I mean by lyric. There's a certain rhythm, a certain musical pattern to this, and it's prose. It could, but there are these poetic qualities to it. During the short winter days, the sun was feeble and pale, shining without heat. Frost lay thick in the mornings, and crusts of hard earth rose in the night on little toadstools of ice. That is a metaphor. That is an image. It's not literal toadstools, but if you think about the frozen ground, if you've ever been outside when winter is really coming on, the frosts are becoming hard, and the ground that has been moist, has been soft, begins to freeze. You'll see, it will rise in places or shrink down. More like shrink down is really what it's doing in places. But you'll see that. And this description of it being like these toadstools of ice. That's what they look like. Footsteps upon the ground rang metal clear, with the hardness, that image. Go down. I'm going to go down to the end of this page on 107, to the beginning of the next paragraph, and again indulge in talking about some lyric language. The cold increased, and the whole valley was drawn as tight as a drum. You have to think about that. And what does that mean, to be drawn as tight as a drum? I'm not going to tell you what that means. It gets in your mind. You can turn that over. It's more of a sensation than anything. How it feels. At this seasonal moment. The breaking of a bough in the wood shattered the air. The sound dropping down the hills, striking against icy ridges. The sound becomes a physical thing, not just a sensation, but it actually becomes manifested as something solid. The sound shattered the air, the sound dropping down the hills, striking against the icy ridges. That way of making the sound, the way the sound carries, the way the sound conveys from a branch being broken to the ear, as if it's something physically in motion. I went up on the mountain beyond the beech grove and gathered small lumps where the coal bloomed darkly under the ledge. Again, that's something done, historical accuracy. Digging coal just out of the hillside, just where it can be found, and bringing it, as a fuel source to be stored and accumulated and stored for the winter. Okay, so now on 109 now, we get the story of Jolly's crime. Uncle Tall had married one of Pate's daughters. It had been the dam built across Troublesome Creek that Uncle Jolly hadn't liked. Pate Horn, this character is being mentioned. The fish couldn't jump it, and none could get into Lean Neck to spawn. He sent Pate word to open one end of the dam until the spawning season was over. Pate didn't move a peg. Uncle Jolly went down one day and set off 2 sticks of dynamite under the left bank, blowing out tree logs. He went down with daylight burning to blow that dam up. He wasn't sneaking to do it. So that's why he has been sentenced to 2 years in prison. He has blown up this dam, and it's you can. You can see from Jolly's point of view the rightness of his act, or why he would consider this to be a right act. The stream belongs to all, from Jolly's way of thinking. It's not to be dammed up by one person. So it's just realistic concerns and accurate concerns of the time. As the winter progresses, Poppet does die, the horse. The winter is passing. On page 110, again, lyric language and imagery that I just want to note. January was a bell in Lean Neck Valley. The ring of an axe was a mile wide, and all passage over the spewed up earth was lifted on frosty air and sounded against fields of ice. Icicles as large as a man's body hung from limestone cliffs. Grandma listened to the weather noises when her work was done. She was better now. At times, when the wind was not so keen, she cooked on the stove instead of the fireplace, but it was hard to keep warm in the drafty kitchen. They get word that Jolly is going to be coming home unexpectedly earlier. Yeah, he had just begun his sentence, but something has happened. There had been a fire in the prison. "Mommy, do you reckon he broke jail during that fire?" he asked. "He ain't nice. Started his term." It's Luce's, or Tall, Uncle Tall, one of the other sons. "Jolly is liable to do anything he sets his mind to," Grandma said. "He always had his mind on looking after his old mommy. I reckon he'd do anything to get free." Suddenly, he was there one morning hollering to us from the yard. There was Uncle Jolly. And Uncle Jolly he is all just vigor, high humor, joking around, in wonderful spirits so much of the time. There are some moments when you see his spirits being dampened, and that again speaks to his characterization. So the story of the fire on 113, we have this at the bottom of the page. This is Uncle Jolly speaking. "It was the biggest fire ever was," he said. "It caught the wood shop and tool sheds, and it was eating fast. It might have got the jailhouse if I hadn't stayed there and fit it with a water spout. Everybody else run around like a chicken with its head wrung off. Then the governor heard how I fit the fire and never run, and he gave me a pardon. He sent me word to go home." Grandma settled in her chair. "It was dangerous, son," she said. "It might have burned the jail. Whoever sought that fire ought to be whipped with oxhide. Some folks is everly destroying and putting nothing back. Who lit that fire, son?" She knows that Jolly is the one who lit the fire. That is another expression of kind of humor. Jolly sets the fire, but then he fights the fire, and because of that, he is released. He's seen as kind of being this hero. I sawed it, Mommy, he said. He took another slice of meat and heaped more bean on his plate. Grandma sat quiet and watching, her blue-veined hands clasped in her lap. Her face was sad, but her eyes were bright with wonder. You know what I done coming up Troublesome Creek this morning? Uncle Jolly asked suddenly. I pulled another log out of Pate Horn's mill dam. There's a good-sized hole now. The perch will be swarming into Lean Neck this spring. And when he had finished eating, pushing his plate back, I heard Brack Baldridge has moved into the camps, moved off that hill place he owns down to Blackjack. So the narrator's family has moved from the little farm they had been keeping back to the coal camps. The coal camps are opening up. So the inevitability of that has occurred, and the narrator will be joining them there after a period of time that he spends with the grandmother. Okay, now in the next section, much of what occurs in this part of the book, while the narrator is spending time with the grandmother, is that the grandma is imparting the family history to him, to the narrator, to the young boy. Things that he needs to know about his family. You recall in the earlier part where he gets into the fight because he's been told that the Baldridges are cowardly, that his grandpap Middleton was murdered and nobody did anything about it. These things still weigh on his mind. So he is being given the sort of history of the family. And much of the history comes across to him, and he internalizes it almost as if it's kind of a myth, as if it has a quality of myth, of historic heroics. So here, the grandmother is telling this story of this great natural event that occurred when she was young, when she was just married, and there had come this great flock of pigeons. You may or may not know that there was a time when carrier pigeons were in they were like the buffalo. Okay, they were just enormous, huge passenger pigeons, they were called, not carrier pigeons, passenger pigeons. Enormous populations of these birds that then they were killed off, much like the buffalo, and I think they're considered extinct now. But she is describing this huge flock of these birds that comes over. And this is not hyperbole. This should not be taken as hyperbole. This should really be taken as kind of a realistic first person expression of something to be something, of how something was. Even, this is fiction, but so she's speaking. Them pigeon birds were worse than a plague writ in the book, Passenger Pigeons. Grandma said, it was my first married year, and Boone and me had grubbed out a home seat on Upper Flat, whole planting 4 acres of corn. We'd got a garden patch put in and 4 bee gums working before I turned puny, setting in wait for our firstborn. I'd take a peck measure outside and set me down on it where I could see the garden crop growing and the bees fotching sweetening. There was a powerful bloom that year, as I remember, and a sight of seasoning in the ground. Still, has this awareness of how nature works, and he's talking about these bees and the seasoning in the ground. And this just has, that idea is of the quality of the earth and the season. And he's just talking. He's just sort of giving us this idea of the bees at work. And what ecologically, one of the things that is of concern now is the fragility of certain aspects of nature, the fragility of the ecosystem, and particularly of bees, because bees are known to be essential to the pollination of crops. Okay, that doesn't change. Okay, that has not, that cannot be replaced by technology, and still just has no awareness of this. Okay, so as she's telling this story now, what I'm going to do now is talk a little bit about how this section is narratively structured. So looking at it as a matter just of writing ability. While she is telling the story, they're baking bread. They're breaking bread in the fireplace, and the narrator is hungry, and the narrator is simultaneously listening to the grandma tell this story and anticipating this bread being done, and he's hungry and he's impatient. Okay, so narratively, how this is working, what the effect of the grandma telling the story of the pigeons is to take us out of the present time of the narrative, what's in fiction writer terms known as base time. That's just the immediate time in which the story is taking place. It's essentially a kind of flashback. It's not, maybe not technically a flashback, because it's coming through the grandmother relating a story, but it has the effect of a flashback. So one of the purposes of the bread baking and the attention on the bread baking within this this section of narrative, the arc, is to bring us as readers back to that base time, but also the anticipation that the narrator has for this bread baking adds to the growing tension of the grandmother's story. It just enhances it. Okay, so 116, bread smells thickened in the fireplace, and I stuck the straw into the ash hill. It came out with a sticky lump on the end. My hunger could hardly wait the slow cooking. I turned my head so Grandma couldn't see me eat the dough from the straw. It was early of a May morning when the pigeons came, Grandma went on. A roar shot up across the ridge, and Boone came down out of the field, looking north where the sound was. We waited, dreading the wind, tying knots in the young corn, but nary a cloud we saw. The sound got bigger and nearer. Hi now, you get inside, Boone said, and I did, fearing my child would bear a mark. Okay, worried that a mark being a deformity, part of the sort of the cultural beliefs, in signs. There's a belief in natural signs and portents, and this is not something necessarily to be taken lightly, and it's not something that is solely existing within the culture of Eastern Kentucky or the Appalachian region. Okay. All cultures have some element, not just some, but much of an element of this kind of magical thinking, I guess you could call it. But she believes that it's belief that this almost wondrous, overwhelming expression of nature will have a direct effect on what she is going through, on her pregnancy. So go to page 117, bottom of the page. Grandma balled hands on her knees, waiting until the smoke thinned and the ashes settled. It was the next day the birds came a-thrashing through the hills, she said. I was sitting in my garden, guarding again the crows, and I heard a mighty roaring like a tide untroublesome. Boone was in the corn patch, so I never went inside, wanting to get a square look at the birds. I never gave a thought to me being so puny. In a spell they come o'er the ridge, flying low down, a-settling. A passel sot down in my garden and began to eat and scratch. I run up and down, hollering, throwing clods and crying. It was like trying to scare a hailstorm. The birds worked like ants now. I run and hollered till I couldn't, then set me on the ground, feeling sick to die. Next thing I know, I was in the house, and there was a granny woman sitting beside the bed, holding something wrapped in a cover. Now I knowed what was in that cover, blanket. But I was scared to look. Boone came in laughing and said it was a boy child. It was Tall, our firstborn. He brought the little tick to the bed, and I couldn't wait to look, asking, has it got a mark? No mark particular, Boone told me. His left hand ain't natural, though. The cover was open, and there the chap was, his little face red and wrinkled. Boone pulled the left hand out, and on the side was an extra finger piece, no bigger than a pea, having nary a nail nor joint. I cried, looking at a little stub of an extra thumb. Not an uncommon thing, necessarily. Just a little bit of a birth deformity mark of some kind. And Boone cuts it off with a razor. Just a little imperfection. But that profoundly affects that moment, that thing so profoundly affects the grandmother that she carries it with her still. And the very end of this chapter on 119, the granny woman cooked a pigeon pie for supper, but I couldn't touch a bite. I've never ate a bird since. The bread was done. I raked it out on the hearth, blowing ashes from the crust. When it was broken, the goodness of it filled my eyes and throat. A pair of pigeon wings would go good with this bread, I said. Grandma looked hard at the bread, then broke a piece for me, taking none for herself. She took the poker and shook the oak knot fiercely. I ain't a grain hungry, she said. Next chapter. More history. The grandmother talking about her life to the narrator. I bore 8 chaps, and not one died of a bullet, Grandma said. She sat on a 3-legged stool beside the hair trunk, speaking of Grandpa Middleton in times past. Think about that attitude, and again, contrast it with Trail of the Lonesome Pine, where feuding and violence is given to us in that novel as if it is a common quality of the mountain people, that violence is just part of who they are, and seeking revenge is such a part of who they are, and the feud is a common thing. Still, in River of Earth, contradicts that completely. The grandmother is proud that her children are not violent. that they don't even carry guns. Jolly doesn't even carry a gun. He doesn't, you know. Not only that, but that they're not sportsmen even. They don't hunt for sport. They might hunt for the sake of food, out of necessity, but they don't kill for the pleasure of it. And that is such a and again, you can't necessarily generalize cultures of people, but that to me is a refreshing contrast to what's given to us in Trail of the Lonesome Pine. And because I find these characters to be so much more compellingly real and more fully developed, so much more convincing. So she's relating her past, talking about the children, and she's going through this trunk of old clothes that she's kept, and she pulls out the shirt on 121. She lifted a white cotton shirt, crackling with starch. The collar was stiff as a harness. Boone, her husband, Grandpap Middleton. I saved it a purpose for recollection. It punishes me to look, though there's a comfort in the keeping, a punishing comfort. I love that phrase, a punishing comfort. 2 bags of quilt pieces were lifted next, a pair of socks, gray and woolly and old. And she brings out this, before I'm getting ahead of myself, they're talking about Boone. Boone wore the socks that she pulls out, these gray socks, woolen socks. Boone wore them on his dying day, on the day Oscoggin took his life for no reason on God's square. Shot Grandpa plumb through, I asked, hungry to hear more. Shot so his life's blood flowed a river, yonder up Lean Neck, where the road comes off the hill and crosses the creek years ago. The spot is marked, I hear, marked peculiar. A locust post was driv on the spot, and I hear it tuck root. I've never been there to see, never. Fired his gun for no reason at all. Boone sold Oscoggin's a nag, and it died with bloats the night after. It crib feed till her belly smothered her heart. Os went crazy mad, saying the nag was sick already when bought, saying he'd been doctored to die, and that's why he gets enraged and kills, shoots and kills Boone Middleton. And on 122, there's a moment a narrative moment that I want to point out. I remembered Oates Brannon's accusing. Okay, remember Oates is the boy who he gets in the fight with. Oates is the one who says, the Baldridges are cowards. His words grew loud in my ears. Oscoggin's killed your grandpap, living free as wind. Yellow Dog cowards, Middletons, Baldridges. Okay, it's still been in his mind. It's been eating at him, and now more information is coming to him, and we as readers, what we see is him working through this conflict. We're not being told. It's not being interpreted for us by the author. We do not have the intrusive author, the intrusive omniscient author coming in. We have simply the narrator, what he thinks, and as readers we're allowed to interpret and to understand. So other things come out of the trunk. An applewood button box your grandpa whittled, kept all my baby's latch pins in it. This pure silver thimble, it was fotched across the waters by my gran, fotched over from England in old times. That reference to held by her gran. So this was, she would have, 1700s would have been when her grandmother immigrated from England. That's the longevity of generations in this part of the world. Now, she has this coat, 123. Grandma lifted the coat, holding it by the shoulder. It was red and beautiful and near my size. I cannot believe such a fine garment would be wasted on my back. I spoke, looking meanwhile at the coat, thinking back. Had they been a horse doctor to tend that nag, they'd been no dying, man or beast. Kate, this is a child narrator still. So this is a young man, 10 years old. But he's reasoning things out. He's thinking about consequences. If that horse hadn't died, his grandfather would not have been shot, would not have been murdered. So he's thinking, like if there had been a veterinarian, a horse doctor, this situation would have been remedied. So he's thinking about his place in the world. And at the same time, he's looking at this coat, and this coat that had belonged to one of the grandma's other children, and there's this like physical connection to the past, and everything is just, all these things are combining the physical artifacts of the past that connect him to his family heritage, and the stories and his own considerations about his place in the world. You can see him being developed in character. You can see him being developed as a person. I long to stick my arms through the warm sleeves of the coat and go running into the cold. I would stand where the wind bittered the stiff fields, caring not a whit for all its blowing. I'm a mind to be a horse doctor when I grow to a man. I am now. I've been figuring. Grandma reached into the elbow-deep pockets, emptying them of cedar shavings. Moths live hard where you keep sweet wood, she said. Her hands flicked in and out. This coat belonged to my second boy, Vester. I made it to pleasure him in his last sickness. Brewed a pot of madder roots to dye red, madder being far and beyond the warmest color. A wee shike-poke of a child Vester was, and thin, but he bore the same countenance as his father, a sight noble to see when he sunk low and was gone. So many of these words have gone out of the language, but there's such a richness with them, with these expressions. I tried to think of Vester, a slim knuckle knob of a fellow, my size and age, but I remembered Oates Brannon instead. Oates and I walking under the apple trees, stepping small amongst the mushrooms, and the old cat with a broken tail worrying the birds. I remembered Oates's tushes, his teeth, his fangs, or like boar's tusks. And I heard his words again. You Baldridges are spotted around the liver. I measured the coat with my eyes, feeling no hope of wearing it, a recollection of Vester to be saved evermore. And I kept hearing Oates speak his hateful words. I stood up suddenly, filled with a great anger. I wonder Os Coggan's still alive, I blurted. I wonder Uncle Jolly. Try the coat, Grandma commanded. I've got a thing to tell you. 125. On Boone Middleton's burying day, I had my boys promise. They took oath on the book. Took it every one except Jolly, he being only 12 and too young for swearing. I said, there's been bloodshed aplenty. Let Os Coggins bide his time out on this earth. Fear will haunt his nights. It'll be a thorn in his flesh. Let him live in fear. He'll never prosper nor do well. Let him live in sufferance. I said this and more. They've all sworn. She has made them swear not to take revenge on Os Coggins. Springtime. Okay, so springtime comes. The next chapter beginning with the seasonal change. Grandma is suffering with the rheumatism and is not able to get about too much. There's further history being related about the narrator's mother, the grandmother's daughter, of course, Alpha, and all the many suitors she had. And among her suitors was one man who became very wealthy, and she never wanted anything to do with him. And on 130, this sort of sums up this history of Alpha and something of her character. Alpha could have had rings on her fingers and combs in her hair, Grandma said, but along came Brack Baldridge from Tribby Camp, a long, lean, strung-out person. Him she took. Married a coal digger, a mole feller, grubbing his bread underground. For gold and silk she'd no fancy, and I was right glad for a fact. But allus I'd wanted her to choose one who lived on the land, growing his own victuals, raising sheep and cattle, beholden to nobody. Now, nary a word I'd say agin Brack. He's good to work, ain't scared to bend his back nor mud his boots. Chap, you've got a clever pappy. Brack's an honest man, but aired Sary kinfolks. I like that. I love that line. 131. Grandma is speaking again. I'd give a year out of my life to see all my children and their chaps, he said at last. A year's breathing I'd give. Never they come to see their mommy, old and thrown away now. I think you have to read this with a kind of an ear to exaggeration on the grandmother's part. She has the right to complain. She does. But when she does complain, there is and maybe you have to be part of the culture or have grown up in the culture to see this, to recognize this. But there's just this sense that I get, or this hint of humor at the grandma that still is allowing us. Never they come to see their mommy, old and thrown away now. No good to fotch and carry for a soul. I'm old and useless and I can't do anything. Anger rose in her throat. She struck her elbows against the tick. When my dying day comes, I'm right willing to be hauled straight to Flat Creek, burying ground, and put inside my man, buried down and kivered over against any of my blood kin was told. You don't even tell anybody when I die. My chaps won't come when I'm sick and Penley. They ain't use in coming to see me lay a corpse. That's, again, wonderful characterization that occurs there. Okay, now in this next chapter, this is very much a chapter of humor, a chapter of entertainment. Uncle Jolly is breaking new ground. He's plowing with a mule, and the narrator is wanting to learn how to plow. So he goes up to where Jolly is, and there's this kind of throughout the entire chapter, there is a joke that is established. So much of what occurs in this, the action, the details that occur throughout this chapter, involve leading us to this moment of a joke of what Jolly pulls a Rusty. He gets a joke on the narrator, but then the joke is gotten back on him as it is supposed to be. Okay, so the narrator brings Jolly some water. This is on 133. Jolly drinks the water. He lowered the jug and stuck his tongue out. Seems a bullfrog swum here, he said. It's sort of wild. He took another long drink. I reckon he drank a quart. All is like the wild taste. The wilder, the better. Okay, so that's a line to be remembered that will come back to us. So they're talking about the plowing and the mule. And in 134, Uncle Jolly says, "Ain't many folks know how to tend dirt proper," he said. "A mighty spindling few. Land a wasting and a washing up and down Troublesome Creek. It's the same. Timber cut off and hills eating down. It's alike all over. Boone's Fork, Little Car, Quicksand, Beaver Creek, Big Leatherwood. These are all real place names, just so you know, that still exist. What folks going to live on when these hills wear down to a nub? Uncle Jolly complained. And he's talking about the mule, and he's saying, this mule, it won't move. It can't be controlled unless you call it by name, and I can't ever remember its name. This fool beast won't move less than you call his name, and that I can't remember. He tried a string of them. Get along, Jack, Pete, Leadfoot, John. He puts the narrators walking in front of him between the handles of the plow. The earth parted. It fell back from the shovel plow. It boiled over the share. I walked the fresh furrow, and balls of dirt welled between my toes. There was a smell of old mosses, of bruised sassafras roots, of ground new turned. So he is plowing. And then after a moment, he realizes that he is by himself in charge of the mule. The mule started after I threw dirt on him. He went down the first row pert enough, ears standing end up, for Uncle Jolly began singing at the top of his voice. Oh, I had a little gray mule. His name was Simon Brawl. He could kick a chew tobacco out of your mouth and never touch your jowl. I plowed 3 furrows, and pride swelled in me as sap blows a willow bud. It was like being master, for till now I'd only stood in awe. It was finding strength I'd no knowing of. Pride of this capability, of this realization that he can do this. When I doubled back on the 4th row, I saw Uncle Jolly sitting on the ground, leaning against a chestnut stump amidst the stickweeds, his eyes closed to the sun. The mule saw Uncle Jolly too, and his ears drooped. He began to walk faster. The harness rattled on his bony body. The furrow crooked a bit, and I got uneasy. Hold back there, I shouted. But he didn't mend his way. It's not an easy thing to plow a straight furrow, and particularly not in new ground. Though what the narrator is doing is he's simply going back over the ground that Jolly has already broken, but still to make a straight furrow, not easy for someone even experienced. So this turns into a catastrophe for the narrator, and that is part of the joke. Jolly has set him up for this catastrophe, for him to lose control and to be dragged about. Several lines, about the last third of the page. The share on 136. The share hooked a root, and the reins pulled from my hands. The plow jumped a furrow, rising alive like, and then I called Uncle Jolly, being at first last more frightened than I shamed. We no longer bore north and south. The mule cut northwest, southeast, back and forth, catty-cornered. My feet flew over the ground. We plowed a big S. We made a long T, crossing it on the way back. I reckon we made all the book letters. We struck into the unbroken tract, gouging a great furrow around and around, curling inward, tight as a watch spring. I couldn't shout or raise a sound. There was no wind left in me. A voice sprang across the bench. Hold there, bully. The mule stopped in his tracks, and I went spinning over the plow. I got up unhurt. A bellow came out of the stickweed patch. It was a laugh near too big for a throat to utter. So Jolly has gotten a joke on the narrator. And now it gets played back on him. Not by the narrator, but the narrator gets the pleasure of it. Very end of this page. When Uncle Jolly had his laugh out, he came across the field weaving drunkenly. The mule watched him come, lowering his head, acting a grain nervous. Uncle Jolly sniggered when he reached us, and I saw a fresh throw boiling inside of him, ready to burst. The mule raised his head suddenly. He licked his yellow tongue square across Uncle Jolly's mouth. "I bet that there's a wild enough taste," I said scornfully. You see the echo back to that line about Uncle Jolly saying he liked the wild taste, a wild flavor in his water. The mule licks his face, and the narrator, the boy, gets the last laugh on Jolly. The Rusty has been returned to Jolly. Okay, next chapter. "She's a traipsing fool," Uncle Jolly said, jerking his thumb toward Grandma. "I never saw a beat, a setting out again daylight, treading the dark God knows where." Grandma is always out walking around, and so often at night. And they begin to discuss this character called Walking John Gay, who's kind of this mythic character. All he does is walk. He is compelled to walk. He walks everywhere. He's always seen walking. He can't keep himself still. And there's this story told about when he comes by at one point, and Boone, Grandpap Middleton, Boone, makes him stop and wait a while, and then he keeps asking him questions about where he's been and what he has seen, and why do you how is one ridge different from another, and why do you keep doing this? And all this time he is just unable to even keep himself still. Page 142, bottom of the page. "Looky here, feller," he said, "you stay near the house, and when I take you to Blackjack, we'll go the long way, around Redbird River way. There's a pretty little woman I want to see on Left Fork of Troublesome. We'll make a circle round. We'll go to Troublesome, on to Ball, and down, cutting across Bloody Breathitt to Leslie County. A sight of things you'll see on Cutchin, Big Greasy, and Goose Creek. A far piece, but we'll go. Real place names that still exist. Now, obviously, the places exist, but the place names as well." Jolly's again singing. There's on 143. There's a section here. I just wanted to point this out for one particular phrase. "Old Taut Hall, killing Frank Salyers, Old Taut Hall, sitting in jail, writing 2 letters to his brother, see your satisfaction, brother, now farewell." And then he sang "Rich and Rambling Boy," these old songs. And he's worried about keeping up with Grandma, and she wanders off. And he tells the narrator, you go this way and look for her, and thus this begins a brief, almost epic journey. It takes only a couple of pages, but it's almost in the nature of a classic hero's journey. And so the boy goes, and he thinks, I know where she's gone. She's gone to where the spot where Grandpap Middleton was killed, and he decides to go there to seek that out. So so this becomes like a journey of fulfillment for him. "I came suddenly upon the marking stick. It was no stick at all. It was a full-grown locust, blossoming leaves. It slanted out of the creek where it was first driven, and where it grew, Grandpa Middleton had fallen, and his life had hurried like a bird startled on a nest." And the grandmother isn't there. But one of the things that happens on a hero's journey, classically, is they will encounter curious people, strange creatures, dangers. It's a hero's journey. and he sees unusual people. The horses, he sees these two men riding. The horses' flanks were lathery with sweat, and behind them a little bull of a man came walking. He wore a mine cap with carbide lamp atop. Thick his chest was, and a fleece of black hairs curled out of his shirt. I stepped from the elders, and he spied me. "Be dom," he said, and stopped, trying to skeer a feller. He wiped a sleeve over his face. He took off his cap, and his head was clean as a shaven jaw. "Now, no," I said. I looked at his double ankles and his double thumb joints. "Be dom," he said. I thought pine blank he was a mountie cat about to spring. He laughed, the flesh of his face catching into a hard knot. "Be dom," he said again, and walked the footlog. And the narrator turns this into a story. He's thinking, okay, I'm going to go tell the story of this little man I saw. A feller not 5 feet high come along, and I skeered him proper, a low-standing feller. Oh, he was a little keg of a man, round and thick and double-jointed. A mountie cat he thought I was, fixing to spring. "Be dom," he kept a-saying. I could tell this little fist of a man never speaking of the locust tree. Never a word of how it grew, tall now and shaggy with leaves. He's not going to tell about there's an instinctive quality in this character, a sensitivity to other people's feelings, but also to just the creatures in general. He doesn't know why he should not talk about the locust tree. He just knows that he shouldn't, that it will cause pain. I turned down the creek, going back the way I had come, going from this death place as from a new grave. I looked back once. "Brother, now farewell," I said. Echoes to that line of the song that Jolly had sung earlier. The next chapter, there's two men who come along to bring news that something has happened at Oscoggins place. Someone has cut his wire fence, and his livestock has gotten loose and destroyed a good part of his crop, and they're suggesting that it's Jolly that has done this. Jolly always getting blamed for what happens to Oscoggins, and he's upset about that, and he's intent on proving that. And on 151, "My wire cutter's as dull as a froe. Ain't been used God knows when." A froe is a tool. Look it up. Google that and see what you find. "God knows when. I can prove." He won't be asking proof. Oscoggins won't. Uncle Jolly blew a stiff breath of wind out of his chest. His face loosened and he grinned. "By grabbies, I ain't too good to cut his fences. I ain't too good now." His mouth opened and he began to laugh. "I'd give a war pension to know who done it. I would. It's a fact I didn't." He glanced at me. "Go fotch the wire cutters hanging next the harness to the corn crib wall." "Leave them be," Grandma said. "Oscoggins old one being I got no pity for. There's a curse on his land. I fear he's got fields, won't even grow stickweeds." "Fotch 'em," Uncle Jolly repeated. I ran to the barn and searched the corn crib. The rotting leather of Poppet's harness rested on a peg. Mice fed the collar, having built a nest in the straw padding. Around the wall were trace lines, wire stretchers, post-hole diggers, and swingle trees. A dehorner hung with a nail in its mouth, but the wire cutters were nowhere to be found. You might wonder what a dehorner is. Look it up. Google it. What's it used for? The cutters are gone. Now, notice narrative of what's occurring here. Bottom of the page, 152. "The cutters are gone," I said. And the grandma responds to this. "Listen, child." Grandma spoke impatiently. I run after till it flew. There's this bird that's been flying over, this water bird that's unusual to the region. It seems like it might be a swan or something like that. I run after till it flew beyond sight, Uncle Jolly went on. Then I come on them fellers riding down creek. All is one of the cold, I said. All is dead. I said to them daubers, come your next trip, bring an eyewitness to settle your lies and tell Os Coggins to stand clear, or I'll give him something regular to grunt about. He's already drawed more breath than's his due. All is dead long for a colt, I said. Notice how narratively Still is able to blend so much in, bringing these recollections from the narrator, reminding us that this narrator is a persona, a character himself. And also what happens within this section is if there's just very subtle insinuations of the situation. The grandma, when she says, listen, child, directly after the narrator says the cutters are missing, their cutters are gone, as if to distract him, as if so that Jolly will not hear him say this, and as she wants to sort of put this matter away. She's done that throughout the chapter. She just said a thing here or there as if she's wanting to distract from the discussion about who cut Os Coggins' fence. Next chapter, Uncle Jolly is in jail again. And we began again seasonally. The chapters very often, there's a change of season to take us into the next chapter. The pawpaws got ripe in early October. How many of you know what a pawpaw is? I hope all of you do. In early October, while Uncle Jolly laid out a 2-week spell in the county jail for roughing Les Honeycutt and a box supper on Left Troublesome. He gets in a fight with Les Honeycutt over a girl. Uncle Jolly always, in the ways that he gets into trouble, are almost out of a kind of innocence. Getting in a fight over a girl seems like this perfectly natural thing for somebody to do. Dynamiting this dam so that the fish can spawn, an excusable act. So they're going. The narrator and Uncle Tall are going to the county jail to visit Uncle Jolly, and the narrator is taking Jolly some pawpaws because they're a treat. The jailer is discussed, log is discussed, and here's an occasion where we do see Uncle Jolly disparaging a bit. He's despondent about his situation. He's depressed, actually. Jolly is a character who he's extroverted. He's outgoing. He needs the company of other people. He is at his best when he is interacting with other people. It's very difficult for him to be sitting in jail by himself. He says, when there were other inmates in here, I was doing okay, but everybody's been released so that they can go get in their crops and then they'll come back and serve later. But I'm here by myself, and it's very difficult for him. There's a suggestion that maybe the narrator will stay for a while with him, and he's not been sentenced, but we have the situation is and still speaks so wonderfully to politics now, the politics of the time, and I would argue the politics of the 1930s not that much different than the politics of contemporary times. The sort of corruption that's just innate. So the county judge is involved in this. 161. With election time near, the county seat was filled with people, their mounts chalking stiff hills in the courthouse yard. Before daylight, horses came sloshing through the creek, setting hoofs carefully into dark waters. Candidates thicker than groundhogs in the roast deer patch, Log told us. Log is the jailer. Got where a feller can't go down the road peaceable. Bet you argue as many votes as the next one, Uncle Jolly said. I don't worry a man's years off ears. You'd vote your old nag and Jenny if they was registered. I get a vote any way can be got, buy or swap, hog back or straddle pole. But when they're drapped in the ballot box, Allah says, boys, count 'em square and honest. I think that resonates with recent history in this country. Let's see. Les Honeycutt has been talking to Judge Malden. Judge Malden is up for re-election. Log comes and speaks to Jolly. I seen Les Honeycutt talking to Judge Malden. I figure he's trying to get you sent back to Frankfort, to the penitentiary. Les's folks can swing nigh every vote on Jones Fork, and the judge knows it. He can't be re-elected without the Honeycutts again him. I never pushed Les's ribs in fur enough, Uncle Jolly said. I reckon the judge ain't going to give Plum over. He'll be needing a few Baldridge and Middleton votes on Little Car and Defeated Creek. That Les Honeycutt ought to have his long nose trimmed and pickled in vinegar. You ain't got a chance of locking me away from Tina Sawyers. You can't lock bees from a honeycomb. So the situation is that the judge, Judge Malden, is worried about getting reelected, and if he releases Jolly, then he's going to lose votes from the Honeycutts. If he goes too far with keeping Jolly incarcerated, he will lose other votes. So he comes and he says, I'm going to do this. I'm not going to send you back, he said. I got it figured this way. You stay in jail till election day, then it won't matter who rows up. I just want me one more term. Log will loose you the minute the Honeycutts get voted on Jones Fork. That's 8 days a coming, Uncle Jolly said. It'll keep me here plumb till hog killing time. Like sitting on a frog gig, staying, and me knowing I could snake out any time the notion struck. He can escape anytime he wants to. So what he does, and Uncle Jolly knows his character. If he does break out, he will get sent back to the penitentiary. And he knows that this is a strong possibility because he knows his weakness of character. It's going to be very difficult for him to stay. Never took a strong idea, he said. I ain't safe in here long as there's a key walking around. I can't trust myself to stay shut up. The judge stood to go, and before that, if you don't stay, I'll be bound to send you back to Frankfort, Judge Malden warned. The judge stood to go. I went up behind him, Log following and locking the door and hooking the ring on his belt. Uncle Jolly thrust his arms to the bars as Log turned, lifting the rings with a finger. Quick as an eye bat, just gets the ring of keys that easily off of Log's belt and gives the key to the narrator to take with him, because Jolly knows that that's the only way that he will stay in jail another 8 days. Now, 165, you go home at the crack of day and get a wad of dirt betwixt us before Log misses it, he said. Give the key to your grandma and tell her to keep it 8 days and then have it fetched back. 8 days and not a minute yon side. Tell her I said it. Okay. And that's the end of this second section. So hopefully you're already through this book. We've been at it for a while. I've been slow getting these lectures up. I'll be very happy when I'm back to in-person classes, and we can have I can have discussions with students directly about these kinds of things, rather than doing these wretched videos. So I will stop this lecture video here. We're already almost an hour and a half. I will do the last video for this text within the next couple of days. Hopefully I'll have both of these up by, let's say, Monday. I will make the test available for River of Earth early next week, and just keep it open for a couple of weeks so that you have some time to do it. And we'll go into Gurney Norman's book of short stories, Kinfolks. That's your next thing to read. These are very short stories. It's a slim book. The stories are very short, and you'll be able to read it very quickly. I think we can cover that easily in about a week. The stories are just very short. They go very fast. So you should be able to read that within about a week. We'll spend more time on it because there's things that I want to say about it, and there's some other material that I want to share about that. So we'll have that, and then there'll be another test about that. And I'm going to assess this week how much more. We have a couple of books after Kinfolks that I have on the list, and I'm going to assess how much of that material that we can reasonably cover in the time that we have left, and I will relate that to you this coming week as well. Okay, that's the end of this video. Hope you get something from it.